The lights of Fifth Avenue reflected off the window pane of the 42nd floor office, where Henry Whitmore stood motionless, his hand still clutching the stack of documents he hadn't turned. Night had fallen, but New York never slept. And tonight, one man was learning to hold his breath in a city that never stopped breathing. Henry, a renowned tech entrepreneur, once called the mind behind the first generation of empathetic AI, was no stranger to resistance, counterattacks, or debates. But he never thought he'd face betrayal, especially not from the woman he once extended his hand to during the brightest days of his youth. The small USB lay quietly in the drawer, a lifeless object that held everything capable of collapsing an empire. Henry had calmly plugged it into his laptop that afternoon, after IT flagged a suspicious login. He wasn't in a rush. He wasn't paranoid. He believed in probability and hoped he was wrong. But he wasn't. The data was precise. Hidden money transfers, forged contracts, even unauthorized access to internal systems, all signed under Madison Whitmore, his wife. The same woman who just a month ago had walked beside him at the Met Museum Gala, beaming like betrayal had never been in her vocabulary. Something strange about betrayal is that it doesn't arrive with thunder, but with silence. A silence sharp enough to cut, like the quiet sigh Henry released as he closed the laptop, walked to the window, and looked down at the city where he once dreamed of building a peaceful family. Madison came home late that night. She let her hair down and hung up her coat like any other day. And Henry, instead of confronting her or raising his voice, just looked at her with a softness that hurt. "I found the second password in your leather wallet." She looked up, a flicker of a smile, then gone. No denial. No script left to perform, just the space between them, and the truth standing in the room like a third party, no one invited. Henry said nothing more. He didn't need to. He walked out of their luxury apartment of 6 years with a single suitcase and only one sentence. "I didn't lose you, Madison. I just found myself." 3 days later, he sat in his attorney's office, signing the divorce papers without looking back. But right there, a different door opened. "There's an option," the lawyer said, voice low but firm. "Keep her name out of your shares and your reputation intact. A new marriage. Safe, emotionless, but legally strong enough to hold your position as CEO." Henry smirked. A marriage. To protect power. He was once married for love. In the end, he loses both love and trust. Marrying for strategy would be the more honest move. Elsewhere, under the soft glow of old Harlem buildings, Layla Brooks was finishing the last lines of her lecture on Emily Dickinson for her night literature class. She had no idea that just weeks from now, the world she preserved with caution and logic would be swept into the storm of a contract, a man, and the kind of things that weren't supposed to happen to women like her. Because sometimes, what changes a life forever isn't your choice, it's someone else's. Dear friend, have you ever stood before a decision so big that you weren't sure whether it was a beginning or an ending? If you've ever felt like Henry alone between success and heartbreak, leave us a comment below. We'd love to hear from you, even just one line. And if this story touched something inside you, a scar, a memory, or simply a quiet feeling, drop a like so we know you're here with us. Don't forget to follow the channel so you won't miss the next part of this journey. Because maybe, somewhere in the pieces of Henry and Layla's story, is a part of your own. The clock in Henry's office ticked in steady rhythm, filling the space with the kind of silence that doesn't calm, it measures. Each tick reminded him that time was moving, even if he wasn't. Outside, Manhattan gleamed behind the floor-to-ceiling glass, its skyline bold and unapologetic, just like the empire he had built. Yet in that moment, surrounded by accolades, patents, and 12 years of uninterrupted ambition, Henry Whitmore had never felt more displaced. It had been 2 weeks since the divorce was finalized. Madison's name was removed from the company registry, and the tabloids, insatiable as ever, had begun to quiet down. But behind the PR spin and clean legal exits, there remained a fracture no contract could erase: the board's unease. "Your single status is raising questions, Henry," said Olivia Tran, the firm's general counsel, as she slid a thick folder across the conference table. "To some, it looks unstable. You lost half your equity during the divorce. They want reassurance that you won't lose the rest, especially not during a merger year." Henry didn't respond immediately. He flipped the folder open with practiced calm. Inside were profiles. Women. Clean records, discreet histories, no public controversies. This wasn't matchmaking. It was market analysis. He let the silence hang before asking, "And this is how we define trust now?" Olivia met his gaze evenly. "Trust can be negotiated. Love cannot. We're not asking you to fall for someone, Henry. Partner with them." It sounded clinical, almost transactional. But in a world where everything, privacy, loyalty, even silence, could be monetized, perhaps this was the most honest thing he'd heard in weeks. Layla Brooks sat on the worn velvet couch of her tiny Harlem apartment, an open envelope in her lap, and an untouched cup of tea cooling on the table beside her. The letter was from the city. Final closure notice for the adult literacy program she'd spent 5 years building from scratch. Low enrollment, lack of funding, and no political interest. Just words on a page, signed with ink, but devoid of heart. She folded it slowly, pressing the crease with her thumb. It wasn't that she hadn't seen it coming. She had. But knowing something doesn't always make it easier to let go. A soft knock at the door broke her thoughts. Standing in the hallway was Dean Willis, a longtime donor and retired judge who had occasionally audited her classes. He held a manila envelope in one hand and a look of uncertainty in the other. "I have a proposition," he said after she let him in. "And I need you to hear me out completely before you say no." It was absurd. People call the kind of thing you read in novels unrealistic. A contract marriage, fully legal, with strict boundaries and generous compensation. The man? A CEO she'd never met. The condition? Appearances only. Discretion mandatory. Duration, 1 year. Outcome, mutual dissolution or renegotiation. Layla stared at the document long after he'd left. Her fingers grazed the place where her name had been pre-filled. Her mind went quiet, not out of fear, but focus. She had never traded her integrity or sold her voice or silence. But this wasn't just about her anymore. The building she taught in housed more than lectures. It held stories, redemption, second chances for people the world had discarded. And if she said no, it would all vanish. Still, she didn't answer right away. She needed to feel it, whatever it was, not be forced into it. When she first met Henry, it wasn't in an office. It was in a garden. To avoid media attention, the preliminary meeting had been arranged in the back courtyard of a library on the Upper East Side. She arrived first, wearing a gray wool coat and carrying a leather-bound notebook. He was late by 7 minutes, not enough to insult, but long enough to notice. "Miss Brooks," he said, extending his hand. "Mr. Whitmore," she replied, her voice even but calm. Their handshake was brief, formal, necessary. Henry gestured toward the wrought iron bench beneath a maple tree. "I'm sure this feels ridiculous. I'm not sure what it feels like yet. she answered honestly. He appreciated that. No performance, no attempt to impress. They spoke plainly about expectations, limitations, and why they were both here in the first place. Henry didn't hide its transactional nature. Layla didn't pretend to be flattered. But somewhere between the blunt terms and quiet pauses, something else flickered a moment of recognition. Not attraction, not even familiarity. It was a subtle awareness that neither was who the world assumed they were. Later that evening, as Layla returned to her apartment, snow began to fall, soft and persistent. She stopped at the corner where the bakery used to be and watched it settle over the sidewalk. Her phone buzzed. A message from Dean Willis. No pressure, but the offer won't stay open long. She looked up at the streetlight and closed her eyes for a second. Sometimes, life doesn't ask you to be ready. It just asks you to be willing. She texted back, I'll sign. And so, somewhere between the edge of survival and the price of salvation, two people who didn't believe in rescue found themselves entering into an agreement neither of them could quite name. Because not all choices are made with certainty. Some are made in silence, in necessity, in hope. The morning of the signing was gray, not stormy, not bright, just muted, like the world had lowered its voice to a hush. The legal office on Madison Avenue was quiet, lined with soft leather chairs and glass walls that concealed more than they revealed. Everything about it felt sterile, detached, and designed for people who made decisions without sentiment. Layla sat across from Henry at the long marble table, her back straight, her fingers laced in her lap. She wore a navy pantsuit, not flashy, not soft, just enough to make her look like a woman who knew exactly why she was there. Henry, in contrast, wore a black tailored suit with no tie, his shirt collar slightly open, polished, but not theatrical. He looked like she remembered. Still, contained, eyes sharp beneath his quiet exterior. The lawyers shuffled through the formalities. Pages were turned, clauses highlighted, and questions asked. Neither Henry nor Layla spoke more than they needed to. When the final page was in front of her, she paused, glancing down at the document that now bore her name in multiple places. Layla Brooks Whitmore. It looked strange in print, not offensive, just foreign, like a costume tailored too well. She signed. Then, almost in unison, he did too. Their pens clicked back into place like punctuation marks. The handshake that followed was brief. Her hand was warm, his, steady. No cameras, no flowers, no vows, just legality. And something quieter. Later that afternoon, they moved into the Whitmore penthouse. The doorman greeted them with a practiced smile, clearly briefed, but still too curious for his good. The elevator hummed as it carried them upward, the city falling away beneath their feet. Henry entered the code without a word, and the doors opened to reveal a space that felt less like a home and more like a luxury showroom. Dark wood floors, glass walls, chrome fixtures, sterile, elegant, vast. Guest wing is down the left hall, he said, setting her suitcase down near the entrance. There's a door that connects to the library. You'll have privacy, but access to anything you need. Layla nodded once. She didn't need a tour. As he turned to leave, she spoke. Do you live in the rest of this place? Or just pass through it? He paused, hand resting on the frame of the hallway door. I pass through it, he said, then disappeared into his side of the home. That evening, the sky dimmed into slate as Layla unpacked slowly. No framed photographs, no perfume bottles, no silk dresses, just books, a few worn cardigans, a jar of tea leaves in a sealed tin. She placed a photo of her former students on the desk by the window, smiling, bright-eyed, holding handmade thank you cards. It grounded the room more than the expensive rug ever could. The first dinner was silent. They ate at opposite ends of a long mahogany table, an unnecessary distant stretch, but somehow fitting. He had a plate of grilled fish and salad. She chose roasted vegetables and rice. Silverware clinked. The city lights glimmered beyond the tall glass panes. Halfway through the meal, Henry looked up. "You didn't ask about the press release." Layla dabbed her mouth with a linen napkin. "I figured you'd handle it." "I did." He tilted his head slightly. "You're an education advocate. Graduated from Howard. Ran a literacy nonprofit. No mention of Harlem." She didn't flinch. "Why not?" His voice didn't change, but something about his gaze softened. "I wanted to protect what's yours, not exploit it." For a brief second, something unspoken passed between them. Not gratitude, not admiration, just the beginning of acknowledgement. That night, Layla wandered the halls of the penthouse barefoot, unable to sleep. She found herself in the library Henry had mentioned, a space filled with first editions, high ceilings, and the faint scent of old leather and dust. As her fingers trailed along the spines of books, she heard footsteps. Henry stood in the doorway, holding a glass of water. "I figured this is where you'd be," he said. She didn't ask how he knew. He stepped inside, nodding toward the shelves. "You can reorganize it if you'd like." The last person who touched it was the designer. Layla smiled faintly. "That explains the alphabetization by publisher." He chuckled once, soft, unexpected. She glanced at him, then really looked. Henry wasn't handsome in the traditional sense, but there was something magnetic about his stillness, like a man who'd forgotten how to move quickly, unless necessary. "I like order," he said quietly, as if apologizing for it. "I like meaning," she replied. "They're not always the same." Neither of them moved closer. Neither reached for more. But that moment standing across from each other, not strangers, not partners, not yet anything defined, felt strangely full. And somewhere in that hollow luxury of a penthouse, too large for two people pretending, a thread was quietly tied. Not tight, not binding, but strong enough to notice. Because sometimes, the most important agreements aren't signed with ink. They're signed in silence. It was raining the next morning. Not a loud, violent downpour, just the kind of rain that blurred the city into watercolor, softening everything it touched. Layla sat at the breakfast nook, a modest corner of the penthouse, overlooking Central Park through glass so clean it felt like air. Steam curling toward her face, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. She wasn't used to silence this complete. In Harlem, even quiet came with rhythm sirens in the distance, laughter from the street, music that slipped through walls. Here, silence was curated, decorated, and somehow lonelier. Henry entered without announcing himself, his steps light against the hardwood. He wore dark slacks and a gray pullover, sleeves pushed up to his forearms. On one hand, it is a tablet. On the other, it is coffee. "Good morning," he said, not casually, but not coldly either. Layla nodded, acknowledging him without interrupting her thoughts. He sat across from her, glanced at her cup. "That herbal?" "Lemongrass and hibiscus," she replied. "Smells like spring," he murmured, then looked back at his screen. They ate in tandem toast, eggs, nothing extravagant. Their movements were almost synchronized, as if the quiet between them had become its language. At one point, without looking up, Henry said, "I have meetings until 3. A security team will be assigned to you if you leave the building. I trust that's acceptable." Layla set down her fork. "I don't need to be guarded. I'm not a liability." His gaze met hers, level. "It's not about liability. It's about perception. Right now, you represent the Whitmore name, even if it's only on paper." She leaned back slightly, the steel of her posture matching his tone. "So, That's what I am now? A projection? He didn't blink. For them, yes. Then, after a pause, but I know you're more than that. The room stilled again, but this time, not in discomfort. Something had shifted. A thread pulled taut. Later that day, Layla walked the halls of the penthouse, taking slow inventory, not of furniture or art, but of absences. There were no family photos, no childhood mementos, no signs of laughter or stories told aloud. Everything was expensive. Everything was curated, and none of it felt lived in. She found the piano in a sunlit corner room, black lacquered, untouched. She ran a hand along the edge and pressed one ivory key. A single note echoed through the stillness, clean and unblemished. Behind her, Henry's voice. "No one's played it since my mother died." Layla turned. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "She taught me," he said, stepping forward. "I hated it. Said it made my fingers ache. But she said it would teach me how to listen." "Did it?" Layla asked. He looked down at the keys. "Eventually." That night, they set boundaries. Not because they wanted to, but because it felt necessary. They sat on opposite ends of the living room couch, a notepad between them. No lawyers, no assistants. Just the two of them, trying to define a marriage that wasn't one. "Separate bedrooms," Layla began. Henry nodded. "Agreed." "No public intimacy unless required." She continued. "I'll follow your lead." She glanced at him. Transparency, but not intrusion. "That works." He hesitated, then added, "But one caveat." She raised a brow. "I won't keep my distance if you're ever in danger. Not out of obligation, out of instinct." Layla looked away, the words landing deeper than she expected. "Noted," she whispered. They didn't finish the list. At some point, the conversation shifted to books, to cities they loved, how she hated elevators but tolerated them for good architecture. He used to sketch buildings in notebooks he'd never let anyone see. The rain continued outside, soft against the glass. Inside, two strangers with a contract began building something less definable. Not trust, not yet, but a truce. Days passed with a quiet rhythm. Henry left early. Layla stayed behind, often in the library, occasionally in the rooftop greenhouse, which she discovered on a whim. She began rearranging books by subject instead of publisher. Fiction on the east wall, essays on the west. She didn't ask for permission. She began. He never objected. One night, as she passed the study, she heard him playing the piano. Softly. Not a whole song, just notes. Scattered, like thoughts with no ending. She stood in the hallway and listened until the music stopped. Then she kept walking, her heart full of something she didn't know how to name. Henry noticed the changes in the air before he noticed them in himself. The way her teacup always sat near the window by mid-morning. The faint scent of lavender drifted through the guest wing. The occasional hum of her voice as she walked the halls alone. He told himself it was nothing. She was fulfilling her role, but nothing more. But one evening, as he watched her from across the dinner table, hair wrapped in a silk scarf, eyes focused on a book she'd brought, he realized he no longer felt like he was performing. And that terrified him more than anything else. Because performance had rules. But whatever this was becoming, had none. It began with something so small, it barely registered. A note left on the kitchen counter. "Don't forget your scarf. Wind picks up after sunset." In Layla's handwriting. Henry found it before his morning meeting, next to a fresh carafe of coffee and 2 slices of rye toast, toasted exactly the way he liked, edges crisp, center warm. He stared at it longer than he meant to, one hand resting on the marble counter, as if the message weighed more than the page it was written on. He didn't take the scarf, but he folded the note and slipped it into his coat pocket. That same morning, Layla lingered a little longer in the rooftop greenhouse. The space had become hers, in a way the penthouse hadn't yet. Untamed vines along trellises, clusters of lavender, basil, and jasmine nestled into corners of warm earth. It smelled like something living, something untouched by steel and glass. She stood before a pot of early hydrangeas, gloved hands gently moving soil, when the door opened behind her. Henry's voice low, careful. "You're replanting the lavender." She didn't turn. "The drainage here is terrible. The roots will rot if I don't lift them." He stepped in, the door clicking shut behind him. The air smelled faintly of rain and rosemary. "I didn't know you gardened," he said. Layla dusted off her palms. "I don't. Not really. I don't like seeing things die quietly." Henry didn't respond right away. But his silence didn't feel dismissive. It felt attentive. After a pause, he walked over to a crate of unused pots, picked one up, turned it in his hands, like a man trying to remember what things were for. "Do you ever miss teaching?" She looked up. His question caught her off guard, not because it was personal, but because it was sincere. "Every day," she said. "But missing something doesn't make it sustainable." He set the pot down. "And was this?" He gestured vaguely toward the building, the contract, the arrangement between them more sustainable. "I didn't say it wasn't lonely." That evening, they passed each other in the hallway. Henry was dressed for dinner with the board, black suit, navy tie, watch gleaming against his wrist. Layla wore a long cardigan over a cotton tank and wide-leg pants, barefoot, holding a half-read copy of Beloved pressed to her chest. He slowed. "I won't be late." She nodded. "Don't worry about me." They stood like that for a beat too long, and then he was gone, the echo of his shoes retreating into the elevator's hush. The days that followed folded into one another in soft, strange ways. They shared the same air, but rarely the same space. Meals were more frequent, but not always together. Notes replaced conversations. Small gestures filled the silences. A book returned to the shelf with a ribbon bookmark added. A tea blend rearranged beside the kettle. A door left open when it didn't need to be. Layla began to notice the details of him, the way he tapped his fingers against his coffee mug while reading. The way his voice lowered when speaking to someone he respected. The way he always checked the room before entering fully, as if measuring his place inside it. And Henry began to notice her quiet gravity. The way she softened spaces by simply being in them. The calm she brought to even the most sterile corners. Her laugh never came easily, but when it did, it lived in the room long after she left it. One afternoon, a soft knock echoed at the library door. Layla looked up from the notes she was organizing and found Henry standing there, not in a suit, but in jeans and a soft button-down. He held a tablet in one hand with a hesitant expression. "I thought you might want to see this," he said, stepping in. He placed the tablet in front of her. The news headline was, "Whitmore announces educational grant in Harlem literacy project." Layla stared at it, then at him. "You didn't ask me." "I didn't want to," he replied. "I wanted to do something that mattered to you." She blinked slowly, absorbing his words like light through a curtain. "I never expected that." "I didn't either," he said, his voice quieter now. "But here we are." Their eyes met. It wasn't romantic. Not yet. but it was honest, and honesty had become the rarest thing in a house built on performance. That night, Layla stood on the penthouse balcony, wrapped in her scarf, the one she forgot the morning before. The wind carried the scent of rain and city dust. Henry joined her, hands in his pockets, shoulders slightly tense. "I never planned for this," he admitted. "I thought, if I kept everything controlled, I wouldn't have to feel the things I used to." She didn't look at him. "And now?" He exhaled. "Now I'm starting to feel anyway." She turned, slowly. "That isn't a weakness, Henry." "No," he said, watching her, "but it changes everything." They didn't speak again for the rest of the evening, but when they passed in the hallway before bed, something unspoken lingered, like the memory of touch without contact, like warmth that came not from proximity, but permission. Because not all walls collapse with noise. Some learn how to open. The invitation came folded in thick ivory paper, embossed with a silver crest and the weight of 1,000 expectations. Henry found it in his inbox first, then again in his assistant's neatly stacked pile of weekly correspondence. The Westmont Gala, held once a year in a restored Beaux-Arts hotel on the Upper East Side, it wasn't just a party. It was theater, a stage where alliances were formed over champagne, where reputations were sculpted under chandeliers. And now, with whispers circling about Whitmore's new marital status, attendance was not optional. It was strategic. Henry left the invitation on Layla's side of the breakfast bar, beneath a small glass vase of eucalyptus she'd placed there earlier that week. He didn't leave a note this time. The weight of the event spoke for itself. When she saw it, her only visible reaction was a slow breath, her fingers brushing the edge of the envelope like it might burn. Two days later, Layla stood in front of the mirror in her suite, adjusting the waist of a deep emerald gown that clung to her like dusk. It wasn't flashy, no sequins, no slit that demanded attention, just elegance, quiet and sharp. Her hair was twisted into a loose chignon, her earrings modest, her lips the color of dried rose petals. She had never attended a gala in her life. She had taught about them and watched them through the detached lens of literature and commentary. But now, she was walking into one, on Henry's arm, in Henry's name. She wasn't nervous. She was focused. The ceiling soared above them, in arches of gold and ivory, in the main hall of Westmont. Crystal chandeliers flickered overhead, casting soft light on gowns like flowing ink and tuxedos cut as sharp as threats. When Henry extended his arm to her before they stepped into the spotlight, Layla hesitated for only a fraction of a second. Then she slid her hand into his, and the world around them blinked into motion. They moved like a unit, not in sync, but in understanding. Henry nodded to investors. Layla answered questions with poise that surprised even the most cynical socialites. They danced once, just once, beneath the hush of violins, and murmured admiration. He didn't hold her too tightly. She didn't follow too closely. Still, their steps fit. "Your wife," someone whispered to Henry near the champagne bar, "carries herself like she's never needed a room to make her important." Henry didn't respond. But his expression betrayed more than approval when he turned back to look at Layla, standing near a marble column, as she listened intently to a journalist he vaguely disliked. It was pride. Outside, later that night, she exhaled into the cold. The gala was behind them, but its echoes clung to her skin. She held her heels in one hand. The city's lights mirrored in the fountain ahead. Henry stepped beside her in silence. "You didn't have to kiss me," she said softly. He looked down, then away. "It wasn't planned." "No?" "No." He paused. But it wasn't pretend either. Layla didn't move. The cold air clung to her shoulders like memory. She turned to face him. "That complicates things. I know." She searched his face for something: regret, hesitation, certainty. What she found instead was clarity. "Why me?" she asked, not demanding, but genuinely curious. Henry's voice was almost a whisper. "Because when everything else fell apart, you didn't." Back at the penthouse, silence followed them like a shadow. But it wasn't hollow. It hummed with all the things they hadn't said. Layla changed into a silk robe and sat at her vanity, slowly removing her earrings, one by one. The sound of his knock was soft, but it reached her before he even touched the door. She opened it. Henry stood there, not with a folder or another financial update, just himself. "I'm not here to push," he said, voice steady. "I just wanted you to know that I meant it." The kiss. She looked at him, not as the man who signed her name into a contract, but the one who stood beside her without armor. "I know," she whispered. And then, almost inaudibly, "Would you stay? Just for a while?" He didn't move quickly. He stepped inside with reverence, as if crossing a line neither of them could redraw. He didn't undress, didn't reach for her. They lay on top of the covers, her head on his shoulder, his hand gently covering hers. The room breathed around them. So did they. Henry woke first, eyes adjusting to the light filtering through half-drawn curtains. Layla was still beside him, her breath slow, the edge of her robe slipping from her shoulder. He didn't touch her. He watched her forehead relaxed, her lashes casting soft shadows against her cheek. In that moment, Henry felt something unfamiliar, something dangerous. Hope.
Chapter Surrogate.
Later that morning, as Layla stood by the window with a mug in her hands, he joined her. Neither of them spoke for a while. Finally, she said, "We're no longer pretending, are we?" "No," he said quietly. And they both knew this was no longer a performance. The act had become real, and neither of them knew where it might lead. Only that they were already walking there, together. They couldn't quite silence the morning after the gala. It settled over them like a whisper. It wasn't dramatic. No sweeping revelations, no impulsive confessions. Just the quiet knowledge that something had changed subtly, irrevocably. Layla moved through the penthouse with the same deliberate grace she always carried. But now, when Henry entered the room, she didn't pretend not to notice. She looked up. She let her gaze linger. And when he caught her eye, he no longer looked away.
Yeah.
They began to move through shared spaces differently. It was in the little things first. He made 2 cups of coffee instead of 1. She began leaving the door to her study open. They didn't talk about it. They didn't need to. At night, their separate wings remained intact. But sometimes, around midnight, Henry would find her in the library, reading in the oversized armchair beneath the dim amber lamp. He wouldn't say a word. He'd sit across from her and open a book, even if he never turned a single page. One night, she looked up from her novel and asked, "Did you ever believe in fate?" He considered it. "I believe in consequences." She smiled softly. That sounds like someone who used to believe in fate and got disappointed. He didn't argue, maybe because she was right. The shift in their relationship wasn't marked by a single moment. It unfurled gradually, like a ribbon untying itself in the wind. They began having honest conversations about things unrelated to business, contracts, or public appearances. She told him about her mother, who used to read her poetry under a flickering kitchen light while braiding her hair. He told her about the lake house where he used to sketch buildings in the summer, long before anything he designed had been turned into glass and steel. They shared opinions on everything from jazz to politics. Sometimes they disagreed, but even then, the tension wasn't sharp. It was textured, grounded in curiosity, not ego. One rainy afternoon, as they stood in the greenhouse repotting jasmine, Layla looked up and said, "You're not what I expected." Henry brushed dirt from his palms and replied, "Neither are you." She smiled without looking at him. Good.
Chapter 2.
The first time she reached for his hand, it wasn't planned. It wasn't even conscious. They were leaving a meeting at the foundation office, walking through a narrow hallway, when a reporter and 2 photographers spotted them. Their names were called out. Flashbulbs sparked. Layla's fingers found Henry's. He held on, not just for the cameras, but with a steadying warmth that surprised her. Later in the car, neither of them mentioned it, but they both kept thinking about it. That night, Henry stood by the window in his office, glass of bourbon in hand, the skyline stretching outward in a pattern he knew too well. Layla walked in quietly, her bare feet soundless on the marble floor. She didn't ask for permission. She never had. He turned when he heard her, and she crossed the room with that unspoken grace that made even silence feel purposeful. "I couldn't sleep," she said. "Neither could I." She came to stand beside him. For a while, they just looked out at the city. "It feels different," she said. He didn't ask what. He knew. "Yes," he said. Then she leaned her head lightly against his shoulder. And for the first time, Henry didn't feel the urge to armor himself in control or restraint. He let it be. One evening, as they stood in the kitchen preparing a late dinner together, a ritual that had become oddly comforting, Layla paused, wooden spoon in hand. "Can I ask you something?" she said, without looking up. "You can ask me anything," he said, setting down the cutting knife. "Why did you build all of this?" Her eyes swept the room, not just the penthouse, but the world he'd created, with its pristine edges and unspoken rules. What was it all for? He looked at her for a long moment. Then quietly, "To be untouchable." "Did it work?" He hesitated. "Until I met you." Layla didn't reply. But that night, she touched his face for the first time just once, lightly, her fingertips tracing the edge of his jaw, like she memorized something she didn't want to forget. And Henry closed his eyes. They still didn't speak about what they were becoming. It was too soon for definitions, too sacred for labels. But the walls were shifting. Where once there had been careful distance, now there was comfort. Where once there had been boundaries, now there were invitations, silent, subtle, never demanded. Layla began keeping her robe on the chair's armrest in his room. Henry started locking his office only after she'd passed by. They hadn't fallen into each other. They'd found their way inch by inch, breath by breath, into something that didn't require falling, something more like standing still, together.
Chapter.
And late at night, when the city curled in on itself and the penthouse felt too large for sleep, Henry would wake to find Layla beside him, barely touching, but close enough that he knew, in the most straightforward way possible, she wasn't going anywhere. And neither was he. The late February sunlight spilled into the penthouse in long, slanted beams, softening the sharp edges of the world Henry had meticulously designed. Layla sat at the window seat in the library, knees drawn close to her chest, her fingers absently tracing the rim of her mug. Outside, the city pulsed on without pause, cars threading through tight avenues, people moving in their usual hurry. But here, time didn't rush. It hovered, as if waiting for something unnamed to arrive. She hadn't planned to stay in his bed the night before. She'd woken in her room, but found herself unable to fall asleep. Her feet had carried her through the hallway without a plan, without pretense. The door had already been slightly open. He had been awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, reading. No words were exchanged. She crossed the room and curled beside him, her hand finding the space between his shoulder blades. And he had closed the book, slowly, carefully, then turned off the light. It wasn't about passion. It wasn't even about comfort. It was about presence. Henry found her in the library that morning, still wearing the oversized gray sweater she liked to steal from his closet. He stood at the doorway for a moment longer than necessary, watching the light catch the curve of her cheek, the way her lashes touched the top of her cheekbone when she blinked. "You're up early," he said. She didn't turn. Couldn't sleep again. "Bad dreams?" "No." Her voice was calm. "Just too much quiet." He stepped inside and sat on the edge of the velvet ottoman across from her. "Isn't it quite what you wanted?" Layla looked at him finally. Her eyes were clear but shadowed. It was, until it started feeling like absence. Later that day, they attended a charity board meeting together, one she'd initially declined, but changed her mind without saying why. It was held in a quiet wing of the public library, in a room full of polished donors and hesitant benefactors. When Henry introduced her as his wife, not as a formality, but with intention, something flickered behind Layla's eyes. Not a surprise, not discomfort. Something more like quiet recognition. And as she spoke eloquently about the need for educational infrastructure in underserved communities, he watched the room watch her. But he was the only one who saw that shift in her shoulders when she realized they were listening. That steadying breath she took when a former senator asked a cutting question. She didn't shrink. She answered with grace, with precision, with truth. He hadn't realized until that moment how much pride could feel like reverence. That night, the snow began to fall, not in thick sheets, but in slow, silent waves, drifting across the glass like secrets. Layla stood in the kitchen barefoot, making hot chocolate with a focus that felt almost ceremonial. She stirred slowly, adding a hint of cinnamon and a pinch of sea salt. Henry leaned against the counter, watching her in that quiet way he had. The way he never looked directly at you until it mattered. "I never saw you in a kitchen before this," she said without looking up. "I didn't have a reason to be. And now," his voice softened, "now I'm finding them." She didn't respond, but her fingers lingered on his longer than necessary when she handed him the mug. They sat on the couch together, legs tangled, sharing the blanket she'd brought from her room weeks ago and never taken back. He sipped the drink, This is good. She smiled faintly. It's the kind of thing my mom made on nights we couldn't afford the heater. Hot chocolate was cheaper than warmth, but tricked us into feeling full. Henry looked at her, the weight of her words settling like snow inside him. Do you miss her? He asked. Every day, she said. But I think she'd like you. That made something in him shift, a pause, a soft unraveling. I don't know if I deserve that, he murmured. Layla tilted her head. Deserve isn't always the point. Sometimes it's about showing up. The next morning, Henry found himself in the kitchen before dawn, trying and failing to recreate the hot chocolate recipe. Layla appeared behind him halfway through, robe loosely tied, hair still a soft halo from sleep. Are you burning the cinnamon? She asked, nose wrinkling slightly. Possibly? She chuckled, then reached for the spoon in his hand. Let me. He stepped aside, but instead of sitting down, he stayed beside her, watching how her hands moved confident, unhurried. Do you always fix what other people start badly? He asked. She glanced at him. Only if I care how it ends. That day, she left a book on his desk, The Architecture of Intimacy. She didn't explain the title or ask if he had read it, but when she returned to the room hours later, it had been moved gently and purposefully to the top of his shelf. That evening, they sat at the long dining table. No guests, no plans, just 2 plates, 2 glasses of wine, the clinking of forks, and a thread of quiet music playing in the background. He asked her if she missed teaching. She said yes. He asked her if she missed being alone. She paused. Sometimes, but not in the way I used to. He didn't ask what that meant, because he knew. There was a difference between solitude and exile, and for the first time in a long while, she wasn't surviving herself. She was being seen. When they parted that night, still in separate rooms, still on separate sides of the hallway, she touched his arm as she passed. Not a kiss, not an invitation, just contact. Like the quiet answer to a question neither of them had spoken aloud. And Henry stood in the hall long after she closed her door, hand resting where hers had been, knowing full well that in a house built of glass and strategy, something real was beginning to take root, not suddenly, not loudly, but unmistakably. And this time, he didn't run from it. The wind howled down from the Hudson that night, curling through the corners of the city, like a secret trying to be heard. The penthouse windows held steady against the gusts, but inside, the air felt unusually still and heavy, not with tension, but anticipation. Henry stood alone in the library, his hand resting on the back of the worn armchair where Layla often read. The room still smelled faintly of sandalwood and lavender. Her soft gray scarf, which she wore on colder mornings, had been left on the windowsill. He didn't move it. He stared at it, trying to understand the strange ache that had settled beneath his ribs. It had been almost 2 months. 2 months since she entered his life, not as a lover, not as a partner, but as a solution. And now, she was the question. Layla didn't come to breakfast the next morning. Henry noticed the absence immediately. Not just the empty chair, but the light from the east-facing windows didn't feel quite right without her sitting in it. He waited 15 minutes before asking the staff. No one had seen her since early dawn. He found her on the rooftop, seated on a bench wrapped in a long coat, a thermos of tea steaming beside her. She didn't flinch when he approached, didn't explain. She just offered the second cup as if she'd been expecting him. He sat without asking. After a moment, he said, "You disappeared this morning." Layla didn't turn to look at him. I needed to hear the world again without voices around me. He nodded slowly, sipping the tea. Did it say anything? Just that it's still here, even when everything else feels uncertain. They fell silent again, but this one wasn't sharp or awkward. It was layered like music resting between notes. That afternoon, Henry canceled 2 meetings and returned home early. Something about the day felt fragile. He found her in the library, barefoot, sitting on the floor between 2 shelves, surrounded by books and papers and the flicker of early evening light. "I'm sorry if I've been off," she said when she noticed him. "You haven't," he replied, "but something is shifting." She looked up, her expression open in that rare, brave way she reserved only for him. "It is. Can you name it?" She hesitated. "Do you want me to?" Henry stepped closer and lowered himself beside her. Their knees brushed. "I want to hear it in your voice," he said softly. "Not in guesses." Layla drew in a slow breath. "I didn't think I'd feel this. This ease. This ache." Her voice didn't break, but it thinned. "It's like I'm being pulled towards something that might be real, and I don't know what to do with that when we started pretending." Henry didn't reach for her. He just let her speak. "I keep thinking," she continued, "that maybe the line between acting and feeling blurred somewhere. And now I don't know what parts of me are real anymore when I'm around you." He spoke only after a pause, his voice even. "You've always been real, Layla. The question is whether I've earned the version of you that doesn't hide." Her eyes met his, wide and unguarded. And for a moment, the room felt too small for everything unsaid. They didn't touch. Not that day, but that night, when she passed his door, she paused. She didn't knock. She didn't enter. But she stood there long enough for him to notice. And then she walked away. The next day was filled with boardroom demands and public appearances. Layla stood beside Henry in front of cameras and whispered questions from reporters, her hand occasionally brushing his arm as they navigated together. He realized he was beginning to crave those small moments. Not the dramatic ones. Not the stolen glances or bold kisses. Just the warmth of her hand on his forearm. The way she leaned toward him when she chuckled. He didn't feel alone in a room anymore. Not truly, because she was there. That evening, they returned to the penthouse later than usual. Dinner had already been laid out, but neither of them was hungry. Instead, Layla moved to the couch and pulled her knees beneath her. Henry poured 2 glasses of red wine and sat beside her, close but not quite touching. They watched the city, the night, the space between them. After a while, Layla turned to him. "What if this had started differently?" she asked. Henry didn't ask what she meant. He knew. He'd asked himself the same question too many times. "I probably wouldn't have let you in," he said honestly. "Not like this." She nodded. "And I probably would have never stayed long enough to want to." He smiled, just barely. "So maybe it had to be this way." Layla's expression softened. "Still, I wish I'd met you before you learned how to hide. I wish I'd met you before you had to protect yourself so much." They didn't say more. They didn't need to. Because that night, for the first time, Layla fell asleep with her head resting against his chest. Not in fear, not out of fatigue, but simply because she wanted to. And Henry didn't move. Not even when the wine went cold. Not even when his arm fell asleep beneath her weight. He stayed. Because sometimes, love doesn't begin with fireworks or confessions. Sometimes it starts in the spaces where two people sit quietly, neither trying to fix the other, neither needing to be more than what they are. Just there, present, listening to a language only they can understand. The wind had stilled. The city had become hushed after days of restless air sweeping across the skyline. The sky held no promise of rain, but there was a certain weight to the clouds, a stillness that made everything feel as if it were holding its breath. Inside the penthouse, the lamps glowed with amber light. Henry sat at the edge of the piano bench, his fingers poised above the keys, but unmoving. He wasn't playing. He wasn't even thinking about playing. He was listening to the silence that came not from absence, but from waiting. Behind him, the door opened without sound. Layla didn't speak as she stepped inside. She wore a soft, black sweater that hung just past her hips and socks that barely muffled her footsteps on the hardwood. Henry didn't turn, but she knew he was aware of her. "I didn't know you still came in here," she said, her voice low, the kind of voice one used in sacred spaces. "I don't," he replied after a moment. "Not unless I need the quiet to echo back something." She moved closer, settling onto the floor beside the piano, her back against the wall, legs drawn up beneath her. He finally played a note, just one, then another, and another. A melody began, not complete or certain, but searching. It wandered through minor chords like someone tracing a memory they hadn't yet earned. Layla closed her eyes. Later that night, they stood side by side brushing their teeth. No conversation, no ceremony, just shared mundanity. Two people existing in the same rhythm. Henry paused before turning off the light when they stepped into the bedroom. "Will you sleep here again tonight?" he asked. Layla looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded, moving wordlessly to the left side of the bed. Her side, now. He didn't reach for her, but he left the space between them smaller than before. It happened sometime just after 2 a.m. Layla woke first, unsure if it was a sound that had stirred her or simply the pull of something intangible. The city was quiet. Henry was still, but her body felt suddenly different, grounded and weightless at once. She sat up slowly, one hand over her stomach. A stillness moved through her again, deeper this time, more certain. She inhaled, then smiled. The next morning, she stood barefoot in the bathroom, one hand resting over the lower curve of her abdomen. Her reflection in the mirror was unchanged. Her skin was the same shade. Her body was no rounder, and her features were no different. But she knew, even before the test, she knew. She didn't tell him that day, not because she was hiding it, but because she didn't want to say it quickly. It deserved more than a breakfast announcement or a line dropped between meetings. It deserved air, a moment, a breath that wouldn't be interrupted. Instead, she spent the afternoon in the rooftop greenhouse, repotting the mint. Her fingers were covered in soil, but her heart felt impossibly light. Downstairs, Henry fielded back-to-back meetings, his phone buzzing non-stop. When he passed through the kitchen mid-afternoon, he noticed the change. The house felt different, like it had been rewired while he wasn't looking. He found Layla in the garden as the sun began to lean west. Her hair was tied loosely, and there was a smudge of soil on her cheekbone. She was humming. Not loud, not melodic, but real. He stopped at the door, watching her. "You look..." He didn't finish. She turned toward him, a little breathless, a little bright. "I know." He furrowed his brow. "You know what?" Layla wiped her hands on a towel and walked toward him slowly. She stopped when she reached him, took his hand, and placed it gently over her stomach. It was the only answer she gave, and the only one he needed. Henry didn't speak for several seconds. He just stood there, his hand on her abdomen, feeling nothing beneath his palm, but everything inside his chest. "Are you sure?" he asked. Layla nodded. "I've known since last night." His breath caught. 1,000 thoughts passed through him. Fear, wonder, disbelief, awe. But his voice was softer than she'd ever heard when he finally spoke again. "We're having a child." "Children," she corrected gently, almost laughing. "Twins." He stared at her. "You already know that?" "I had a scan scheduled this morning. I didn't want to tell you until I was sure." He leaned back slightly, his gaze never leaving hers. "Twins," he repeated, the word tasting unfamiliar and sacred. She smiled, eyes glinting. "My body doesn't do anything halfway." He laughed, really laughed, for the first time in what felt like years. It burst out of him, surprised and whole. Then, he pulled her close in a hesitant and inevitable motion. It wasn't the kind of embrace built from performance or pretense. It was the kind where two people held each other, and everything between them, hope, fear, the sharp edge of change. Later that night, they lay together under the soft weight of the duvet. The city moved beyond the glass, unknowing and unmoved. But inside, the world had shifted. Henry reached over, lacing his fingers with hers. "Are you scared?" he asked. Layla stared up at the ceiling for a moment before answering. "Yes," she said, "but not of what's coming." "What then?" "Of losing the quiet between us, of letting the outside in." He turned to face her fully, his thumb tracing the back of her hand. "Then we won't let it in," he said. She didn't respond. But her eyes softened, and for the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel like a cliff's edge. It felt like a field waiting to be walked through, together. And as the night deepened, and the city breathed around them, Layla and Henry held on to the most fragile and extraordinary thing either had ever touched a beginning. The following weeks folded in on themselves softly and slowly, as if time had grown gentler or more forgiving. It wasn't peace exactly, but it was a kind of steadiness, the kind you only found after a storm had passed, when every object was still slightly damp, and the air still carried the echo of thunder, but the sun had returned anyway. Layla began to wake with the weight of something new, not the heaviness of obligation or uncertainty, but the awareness of life growing inside her. 2 lives, 2 quiet heartbeats she couldn't hear yet, but somehow already knew. She moved through the penthouse like she belonged there now, not as a guest or a contractual wife, but as someone who had begun to leave traces. A new tea towel in the kitchen, a worn copy of The Color Purple on the nightstand. A half-knit blanket was slowly taking shape beside the couch. Henry noticed everything, and for once, he didn't try to rearrange it. One evening, as the snow outside melted into the quiet puddles of early March, Layla stood barefoot in the hallway, her palm resting flat against the cool wall. She spoke softly, not to anyone in particular, but to the small, fluttering sensations that had started dancing in her lower belly. She whispered things she didn't say aloud. Hopes, memories, a lullaby she only half remembered from childhood. Henry watched her from a distance, leaning against the doorway of his study. He didn't interrupt. He just listened, realizing that some kinds of beauty didn't ask to be witnessed, but deserved to be anyway. They went to their first ultrasound appointment together the following week, It was early morning. The clinic was still half lit, and the city was not fully awake. Layla wore a long oatmeal-colored coat and no makeup. Henry held her hand in the waiting room without thinking about it. The technician was kind, speaking in a measured tone as she worked, explaining every flicker of light on the screen. Then came the sound. 3 heartbeats. Not 2. 3. Layla froze, her breath catching. Her eyes darted to Henry, wide and incredulous. "Triplets?" she whispered. The technician smiled. "They're strong. All 3. Henry blinked. For a moment, he forgot how to exhale. His hand tightened gently in hers. Layla laughed, then a low, disbelieving sound, and tears sprang to her eyes before she could stop them. "I guess we don't do anything halfway," she murmured. Henry didn't speak. He was too full of something he hadn't yet named. But when she looked up at him, he pressed his lips to her temple, and for once, the silence between them wasn't quiet.
Japan.
Back at the penthouse that night, Layla sat curled in the corner of the oversized sectional, her body wrapped in a thick blanket, her thoughts loose and floating. Henry was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of broth with more concentration than necessary. Neither of them had touched wine in weeks. Now they drank broth, chamomile, and apple juice with crushed ice. Layla watched him. She didn't say anything, not at first. Just watched how his brow furrowed when he focused, how his sleeves were always rolled past his elbows, and how his hands, once used only for strategy and control, now moved with patience. "Do you ever wonder," she said, "if this would have happened anyway?" He turned, ladle in hand. "What?" "This. Us. These babies." Her hand moved lightly over her stomach, not protectively, reverently. Henry took a moment. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I do know I wouldn't have been ready before." Layla tilted her head. "And now?" He met her gaze, steady. "Now I can't imagine wanting anything else." They didn't sleep separately anymore. At first, it had been gradual, one night here, another there. A touch, a shared pillow, a late conversation ended in her falling asleep mid-sentence. But now, her robe lived on his side of the closet. Her perfume had its place in the bathroom drawer. The shape of their nights had changed without announcement. Henry learned to read her silences when she needed space and warmth, when the quiet meant she was thinking, and when it meant she was afraid. Layla learned his patterns. When his fingers twitched in sleep, it was from dreams he never talked about. When he turned his phone screen face down, it meant the message wasn't urgent, but the moment was. They didn't need to name it anymore. Whatever this was, whatever had started as a performance, had become a truth. Not perfect, but whole. One morning, Layla woke to find him sitting at the edge of the bed, still dressed in last night's clothes, gazing at the skyline. "You okay?" she asked, voice thick with sleep. He nodded, but didn't look at her. "I had a dream," he said softly. "I carried one of the babies and walked through this endless corridor. Every door I opened was empty, and I couldn't find you." Layla pushed back the covers and sat beside him. She didn't ask what the dream meant. She just reached for his hand. "I'm here," she said. His fingers tightened around hers. "I know." Later that afternoon, she painted the nursery. Not a nursery, really, just the spare room on the west side that used to be filled with storage boxes and unused furniture. Now, it smelled like lemon and fresh primer. She chose a pale blue that changed with the light, almost gray in the morning, nearly lavender at dusk. Henry stood at the doorway, watching her roll the paint slowly across the wall. They won't notice this color for months, he teased. I'll notice it, she replied, and he knew in that moment that this wasn't just a room, it was a promise. At night, when the lights were low and the world outside shrank into distant traffic and muffled sirens, they lay in bed with her back to his chest, his hand resting gently over the curve of her stomach. He whispered things into her shoulder, half-formed thoughts, unguarded musings, sometimes nothing. And Layla, still wide-eyed beneath the dark, would sometimes think about how this had started. A contract, a strategy, a necessary lie. Now, no contract could define what they were, no strategy that could have planned for this, only a slow unfolding, a love that hadn't announced itself, but had been building all along, breath by breath, touch by touch, heartbeat by heartbeat. The weeks that followed were soft-edged. Morning light came earlier, slipping past the skyline and pooling across the nursery floor before either stirred. Once bare and echoing, the walls now carried subtle signs of preparation, folded linens on the windowsill, picture books stacked neatly by theme, a trio of identical white cribs standing like quiet promises beneath the painted stars. Layla had added one careful stroke at a time. She moved more slowly these days. Her body, stretched by the weight of 3 growing lives, shifted its rhythms. But she never complained. Her silence wasn't resignation, but reverence, a profound, inward awe. Henry watched it all with a hushed disbelief. Every night, he traced the soft arc of her belly like it held some secret language only his fingers could read. Sometimes the babies kicked hard enough to make Layla gasp or laugh. Sometimes they didn't move at all, and Henry would rest his ear gently against her skin and wait, until the smallest thump reminded him that something sacred was still happening inside her. He had never imagined this kind of intimacy. Not because it was romantic, though it was, but because it was so quiet. This wasn't the kind of love that shouted. It didn't ask for a declaration. It asked for presence. And Henry had learned, finally, how to offer it. One evening, after a long board meeting and a frustrating exchange with a contractor over the penthouse's security upgrades, Henry returned home later than usual. He found Layla on the nursery floor, surrounded by baby clothes, her back leaned against the wall, bare feet stretched out before her, her expression unreadable. He crouched beside her, breath catching at the sight of her exhaustion. "I told you I'd help sort through these," he murmured, gently lifting a folded onesie from the pile. "You didn't have to start without me." "I couldn't sleep," she replied, "and they've been restless all day." She pressed his hand to her belly, and sure enough, a tiny thump pushed back beneath his palm. "They're fighters," Henry whispered. "They're you," she said. He looked at her, but her eyes were far off, staring at something he couldn't see. "You okay?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. Then, "I think I'm afraid of how much I want all of this." He stilled. "Before you," she continued, "everything was survival. I didn't dare want things because the cost of losing them felt higher than the joy of having them." Henry shifted closer. "And now? Now I want all of it. And it terrifies me." His hand found hers, fingers threading instinctively. "You don't have to want it alone." Layla leaned her head against his shoulder, and together they sat surrounded by tiny clothes and quiet confessions. Neither said it aloud, but both knew. Vulnerability had become their shared language. The following morning came with a tension that neither could name. It began with a phone call. Short, clipped. Henry took it to his office while Layla napped, one hand protectively cradling her stomach, even while she was asleep. By the time she woke, his jaw was tight, his eyes distant. "What happened?" she asked, still groggy. "Someone accessed the Whitmore servers through a back door we thought had been closed." His voice was low, measured. Layla sat up slowly. "Is it internal?" He hesitated. "Possibly. It traces back to a former associate of my father, someone who shouldn't have access anymore." She watched him, watched the way his body coiled under pressure. She knew that posture now. He wore it like armor when the past came too close. "Is this about the trust?" she asked softly. "Or something else?" Henry turned away from the window. "It's about control. Someone's trying to remind me I can still lose it." She rose, moving to him without urgency. "Do you think this has anything to do with the babies? I think the timing is too perfect not to." Her hand found his chest, where his heartbeat thudded fast and uneven beneath his shirt. "Then we protect them. However, we have to." He placed his hand over hers. "Even if that means leaving the city." She blinked. "Is that what you're thinking?" "I've already called the lake house," he said. "It's quiet, secluded. The security team can reinforce the perimeter within 48 hours. Layla didn't respond immediately. Her gaze drifted toward the nursery, toward the tiny cribs waiting, the scent of baby lotion that had already begun to linger in the air. "This place feels like home now," she said. "I know. And I don't want to run." "I'm not asking you to run," he said gently. "I'm asking you to let me keep you safe." She searched his eyes, then nodded once. "Okay. Just until it settles." As they packed, the apartment hummed with a different energy that night. It wasn't panic. It wasn't fear. It was clarity. Henry moved through the space like a man retracing the steps of something sacred. His hand lingered over the books on Layla's nightstand, the cardigan she always draped over the chair, the unopened bottle of massage oil he'd picked up but never offered her. She watched him from the doorway. "You're afraid too," she said. He looked up, surprised. "How can you tell?" "Because you only look at the things you love when you're scared to lose them." Henry crossed to her slowly, and for the first time in months, he pulled her into an embrace that trembled slightly. "I can't lose this," he said against her hair. "Not you, not them. You're not going to," she whispered. But even as she said it, something inside her twisted. No doubt. Not dread, just the knowing that love, when it becomes this real, carries a weight nothing else ever had. And that night, as they lay curled around each other in the bed that was no longer just his, the wind returned. It tapped at the windows with a quiet insistence, like a warning too soft to hear. But they didn't move. Because love doesn't always mean fleeing the storm. Sometimes, it means building something strong enough to outlast it. The lake house was quieter than Henry remembered. Nestled between skeletal birch trees and a frozen stretch of silver water, the estate stood like a forgotten story untouched for years, save for the occasional groundskeeper's visit. The snow along the stone path crunched softly underfoot as they arrived, headlights dimming behind them, breath misting into the cold. Layla stepped out of the car slowly, one hand on the curve of her belly, the other wrapped around her scarf. She didn't speak. She looked at the house, the woods, and the dark line where the forest met the horizon. And then at him. He didn't ask what she was thinking. They were well beyond questions like that. Inside, the house smelled of cedar and was quiet. The kind of calm pressed into the skin, asked nothing, and gave everything. The security team had already lit the fire, a low warmth hum pulsing through the great room's stone fireplace. Layla walked to the window, eyes drawn to the lake beyond. "It's still," she murmured, "like it knows we're here." Henry came to stand behind her, his hands slipping into the warmth of her coat to rest against her waist. "Maybe it does," he said. The first night, they didn't unpack everything. They moved like people in a temporary home, bags by the door, familiar items left untouched. But even then, something about the air shifted when they spoke in hushed tones near the fire. Something about the way Layla folded his sweater and set it on the arm of the couch. Henry moved her prenatal vitamins to the kitchen window, where she'd see them each morning. It wasn't just a precaution anymore. It was preparation. 3 days passed with a kind of suspended peace. Henry would make breakfast quietly each morning precisely, as if flipping eggs were his only control. Layla would sit at the small round table, wrapped in a throw blanket, ankles tucked beneath her, sipping warm milk with honey and watching him move. The security reports were always clean. No threats, no activity. But Henry couldn't shake the feeling that stillness often came before impact. On the 4th evening, Layla asked him about his mother. They were sitting on the porch, snow gently falling, her head resting against his shoulder beneath a wool blanket. "She died when I was 17, he said softly. "Heart failure. Sudden, unexplained. I'm sorry. She loved gardens, even in winter. Said the roots dream under the snow, waiting for spring." Layla turned to look at him, her eyes shining in the dim porch light. "You got your quiet from her." "Maybe," he whispered. "Or maybe I just used it to survive, after her silence became permanent." Layla leaned forward and pressed her lips to his cheek, not as comfort, not as answer, but as witness. At that moment, Henry understood something about her that he hadn't fully realized before. She never offered consolation, only presence. And somehow, it was enough. That night, the world came undone. It started with a light. A motion sensor is flickering red outside the southern perimeter. Then static over the security feed. Then silence. Henry was already on his feet before the alert sounded. Layla appeared in the doorway, barefoot, clutching her belly, her robe falling loosely over her frame. "What is it?" she asked. His voice was calm, but sharp around the edges. "Someone breached the perimeter." He didn't wait for her reply. He was already pulling open the panic room door, a disguised panel behind the bookshelf in the hallway. "Go," he said, his voice lower now. "Stay inside. Don't come out unless it's me." Her breath caught. "Henry, I'll be fine. You have to go. Please." She stepped in. The door closed between them with a soft, mechanical hiss. And just like that, the house became still again. But not quite. Outside, shadows moved. Men in black, faces masked, steps fast but practiced. They didn't shout. They didn't hesitate. This wasn't random. It was choreographed, precise. Henry stayed low, moving through the house with the weapon the security team had left him. Every breath was calculated. Every step counted. He saw the first one near the kitchen window. Fired. Missed. Glass shattered. The second one appeared at the back porch. Henry dropped to the floor, returned fire. This time, contact. The man stumbled, fell, and disappeared into the brush. A voice crackled through the house speaker, laced with arrogance. "Mr. Whitmore, we don't want your wife. We want what's coming." Henry's hands clenched around the grip of the pistol. "You'll never touch them," he thought. "Not them. Not her." It lasted minutes, maybe less. But it felt endless. When the backup team finally arrived, sweeping in from the north with floodlights and rifles drawn, the intruders had vanished, only boot prints in the snow, only echoes in the trees. A bullet grazed Henry's shoulder, not deep, but enough to make the world tilt. He collapsed against the front door, breath shaking. And then, the panic room opened. Layla stepped out, her face pale, her hands trembling. But she didn't run to him. She walked. Each step is slow, measured. When she reached him, she dropped to her knees, one hand cradling his face, the other pressed against his chest. "You're here," she whispered. He closed his eyes. Barely. "No," she said, more fiercely now. "You don't get to say that." She kissed his forehead, the taste of blood and salt on her lips. "You stay. You stay with us." And in that moment, broken, bleeding, breathless, he realized something he hadn't allowed himself to believe. She wasn't just carrying their children. She was carrying him. Later, as medics moved through the house and security tightened its circle, Layla sat beside Henry on the floor, their hands still locked together. Neither of them spoke. But everything had changed. This wasn't just a marriage born of convenience. This wasn't just a love that had found its way through strategy and circumstance. This was the kind of bond that could hold up under fire, that could bleed and remain whole. And outside, the lake remained frozen. But inside, the house finally exhaled. The snow outside lingered for 2 more days, as if reluctant to let go of the scene it had just witnessed. In the stillness that followed the attack, the lake house became a sanctuary in a new way, not just a place of retreat, but a cocoon where pain could be felt and healing could begin. Henry's wound was not deep, but it had slowed him. He moved more deliberately now, every gesture carrying the imprint of recent fragility. And Layla watched him with the kind of attentiveness that made words unnecessary. She didn't hover. She appeared when he needed her, like breath, warmth, or time. One morning, he woke to find her sitting beside the window, wrapped in one of his old sweaters, her hand resting on her belly, as if conversing with the children growing inside her. The fire had died down, but she hadn't relit it. "I had a dream," she said softly, not looking at him. "We were in a hospital. I was holding one of the babies. You were crying." Henry propped himself up slowly, wincing. "Crying?" She nodded, not out of fear, relief. He didn't answer. He only studied her, the profile of her face caught in the gray light, the calm in her expression not quite masking the weight beneath it. Then she turned to him. "Do you ever wonder what kind of father you'll be?" He exhaled through his nose, constantly. "And I'm afraid I'll love them so much it will undo me." Layla smiled, faint and wistful. "Then we'll be undone together." They stayed at the lake house longer than planned. There was no further threat, just long days of quiet, nesting, gathering the emotional fragments, and laying them gently back into place. Henry spent hours assembling baby furniture with a calm kind of devotion. Layla knitted small, misshapen socks and hummed under her breath, forgetting the lyrics halfway through. One afternoon, while Henry was reading beside the fireplace, and Layla napped with her head on his lap, he reached over to the small wooden drawer in the end table and pulled something out. A folded envelope, yellowed with time. The handwriting on the front is unmistakable. His mother's. He stared at it for a long time before opening it. The letter inside was short, her voice still alive in the rhythm of the words. My darling Henry, don't run from it if you find yourself loving someone more than you thought possible. Don't protect yourself by pretending it's not real. Let it change you. Let it soften you. That's what love is for. He folded the letter again slowly, slid it back into the envelope, and tucked it into the inner pocket of his sweater. Layla stirred then, eyes fluttering open. You okay? She asked. He bent slightly to kiss the crown of her head. I think I finally am. The snow melted overnight. By morning, the lake shimmered again, a mirror reflecting the pale sky. Spring arrived without fanfare, just the sound of water dripping from the trees, the scent of thawed earth in the breeze. Layla stood barefoot on the porch, her hands cradling her belly, her nightgown brushing the tops of her feet. She felt heavier now, slower. The babies had begun kicking with more force, sometimes taking her breath away. Henry stepped behind her, arms slipping around her waist, face buried in her neck. They're getting stronger, she said. So are you. She tilted her head back against him, sighing. I didn't expect to feel so whole. Not after everything. You don't have to explain it, he murmured. I know. But she wanted to anyway. I used to think love had to be earned. I had to prove something, my worth, strength, and loyalty. But with you, it just happened. Quietly. Without me asking for it. Henry turned her gently to face him, cupping her face in his hands. You never had to earn love from me, Layla. You just had to let me find you. She swallowed, blinking back the tears. And now? Now I plan to stay found. That evening, they made a meal together. It was simple roasted vegetables, fresh bread, chicken soup from a family recipe, which Henry barely remembered how to make. They moved around the kitchen rhythmically, bumping into each other, laughing softly, hands brushing as they passed utensils. When they sat down to eat, neither said much. But halfway through the meal, Layla reached for his hand and didn't let go. There's something else, she said. Henry set down his fork. What is it? I want to go back. To the city? She nodded. I don't want to hide. Not now. Not when everything is about to change. He searched her eyes. Are you sure? I'm not reckless. I'm just done living from fear. I want our children to know the world, not just the quiet parts. Henry let out a long breath. Then we'll go back. She smiled. Together, always. That night, while Layla slept, Henry walked down to the lake. The stars were out more than he remembered. He stood with his hands in his pockets, the letter from his mother resting against his chest, and looked up. He was no longer the man who had designed a life based on calculations and contingencies. That man had unraveled under the weight of something far more powerful. Love had taken him apart, yes, but it had also taught him how to begin again. And somewhere in the stillness, he made a promise. Not the kind you say aloud, but the kind you live. To choose her, every day. To be present, even in fear. To be soft, even when it hurt. To be the kind of father who showed up fully, imperfectly, always. Because love, he realized, wasn't a strategy. It was a home, and he was already in it. The city welcomed them back not with fanfare, but with familiarity. The air was brisk, sharp with spring's hesitation. Traffic moved like breath, impatient, rhythmic, and the skyline shimmered as though nothing had changed. But for Henry and Layla, everything had changed. Their return was deliberate. The penthouse, once echoing with absence, now pulsed with life. Layla strolled through each room, her hand trailing across polished surfaces, noticing what felt different. It wasn't the decor. It wasn't the new security enhancements. It was something quieter, like the soul of the place had shifted in their absence. Henry stood behind her in the doorway to the nursery. "It's warmer," she said softly, fingers grazing the crib's edge. "You're here," he replied. The nursery hadn't changed much in layout, but it now carried the scent of lavender, the softness of folded baby blankets, and sunlight that poured in like a blessing. Layla added 3 plush giraffes to the window seat and hung a mobile above the crib's clouds, moons, and tiny stars she had found on a whim during their last stop before leaving the lake house. "Do you think they'll sleep through the night?" she asked one morning as Henry adjusted the monitor system. "No," he said with a quiet smile, "but we will survive it." They both laughed, tired, content. The days blurred into a rhythm. Appointments, ultrasounds, and gentle walks through the city park when the weather permitted. Henry held her hand at every crosswalk, standing between her and passing cars. It wasn't possessive. It was instinct. One afternoon, Henry excused himself halfway through a meeting with his board. His phone had vibrated only once, and that was enough. He arrived at the hospital in 20 minutes, breath tight, suit jacket flung into the back seat of the car. Layla sat in the waiting room, calm but pale. "They just wanted to monitor some pressure fluctuations," she said before he could ask. "Everything's okay, but they might want to move the delivery date." Henry didn't speak. He only reached out, cupped her cheek, and kissed her forehead. They were ready. They had to be. 2 nights before the scheduled cesarean, Layla couldn't sleep. She moved through the living room, barefoot, her silhouette lit by the city lights beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. Henry found her standing before them, arms wrapped beneath her belly, lost in the shimmer. "Do you remember the first time we sat here together?" she asked, not turning around. He nodded, stepping closer. "You were quoting Langston Hughes, and you pretended you didn't already know the whole poem." He smiled. "I remember thinking I didn't deserve to be in the same room as you." Layla finally turned to face him, her expression softer now. "And now? Now I know I was never meant to be anywhere else." She reached for his hands and guided them to her stomach. "They move more when you speak," she whispered, "like they know you." Henry's throat tightened. "I don't know if I'll be good at this." Layla didn't argue. She didn't offer hollow reassurance. She said, "Be present. That's what matters." The delivery was swift, clinical, but the moment it happened, when 3 cries rose in staggered harmony, time shifted. Henry stood still, breath caught somewhere between disbelief and reverence. The nurse placed the first child, a boy, into his arms. Henry looked down into blinking eyes that mirrored his own, and everything fell away: his title, his wealth, the empire he'd built. Only this mattered. The second was a girl, cheeks round, lips trembling. The third, another boy, released a strong wail that startled the attending doctor. Layla, pale but conscious, turned her head toward the sound. Henry moved beside her, cradling one tiny bundle at a time. She kissed their foreheads with trembling lips, eyes glistening. "You did it," he whispered. "No," she replied. "We did." They returned home 3 days later. The apartment had been transformed, not just with baby gear and soft lullabies playing faintly in the background, but with a new kind of stillness, not empty, full. Layla took the first night shift, refusing to let Henry pull himself from bed while the twins stirred. But at 3:42 a.m., she found him awake, standing silently over the crib, with his hand resting gently on his daughter's back. "She calms when you do that," Layla whispered from the door. "She's already smarter than me," he whispered back. They moved through the sleepless nights and unpredictable days like dancers who had never practiced but somehow always landed in rhythm. And with each sunrise, they learned. They learned that love wasn't in the big declarations. It was in the diaper changes at 2 a.m., in the warmed bottles passed wordlessly, in the shared exhaustion that never once turned to resentment. Henry discovered that his greatest strength was no longer his intellect. It was present. It was showing up even when tired, even when unsure. And Layla learned that trust wasn't something she had to ration. It was something she could give freely and receive back, unbroken. One quiet morning, months later, they sat on the living room floor, surrounded by laughter and chaos, and 3 sets of tiny hands grabbing everything within reach. Henry leaned back against the sofa, one baby asleep on his chest, another gumming a teething ring at his side. Layla sat beside him, her head resting lightly against his shoulder. He turned to her, brushing a curl from her cheek. "We're not who we were," he said. "No," she agreed. "But I don't miss who I was." She smiled. "Neither do I." And there, they became something else entirely in the city that once reflected their distance. Not 2 people navigating a contract, not survivors of betrayal or fear, but a family, built not from perfection or planning, but from the choice to stay, to hold on, and to love again and again, through every quiet storm. Summer arrived like a hush after music. Once a blur of noise and motion, the city slowed just enough to let the sun linger. Sidewalks radiated warmth. Breezes curled around corners with softened urgency. And inside their high-rise home, where light filtered through gauzy curtains, time began to move at the pace of breath. Henry stood barefoot on the balcony one morning, his coffee cooling untouched beside him. Below, New York unfurled in its familiar choreography, honking taxis, hurried feet, voices rising, lives intersecting. But he no longer watched the city for what it could give him. He watched it now for what it taught him to let go. Behind him, Layla sat on the floor in the nursery, her legs folded beneath her, reading a picture book aloud. Her voice moved gently across syllables, rising in rhythm as 2 babies reached toward the pages, and the third curled against her knee, already half asleep. Henry turned. His gaze caught on the soft cascade of her hair, the slight curve of her smile, the steadiness in her presence. This was the story now. Not the past that hurt, not the future they once tried to control. Just this moment, undeniably quiet, unforgettably whole. There were no dramatic endings in real life. No curtains drawn, no applause. Just the subtle shift of one season into the next. And so it went with them. The lawsuits faded, and with them, the headlines. Madison remarried quietly. Henry never read the article. The boardroom drama that once threatened his name became a chapter nobody reread. Investors came back. Deals stabilized. His company rebuilt. Not from control, but from intention. He delegated more, traveled less, spoke at fewer conferences, and spent more time in hospital waiting rooms with Layla, with immunization appointments, sleepy car rides, and nights when a baby cried just long enough to make them both laugh from exhaustion. Their love didn't erupt. It settled into rituals, into glances, into the steadiness of shared silence. One evening, almost a year after the birth, they returned to the lake house. Not to escape, but to remember. The drive was quiet. The trees are taller than before, and the house untouched, yet waiting welcomed them like memory. Layla walked down the old stone path barefoot, her arms cradling their daughter, while the twins stumbled ahead, learning to run in crooked, joy-filled lines. Henry trailed behind, a hand resting on the small of Layla's back every time she paused. They had returned not as survivors, but as something else. As the kind of people who understood that love didn't fix what had been broken. It simply made the breaking worth it. Later, as the sun slipped behind the lake and the children slept inside, Layla and Henry sat on the porch steps, wrapped in a shared blanket. She leaned her head on his shoulder. "Do you still think about who we were before all this?" she asked. He thought for a long moment. "Sometimes. And I think we needed to lose what we had, to find what we needed." Layla smiled, her fingers tracing lazy circles on his knee. "We never had the perfect beginning." "No," he agreed. "But we stayed. That's better." She looked up, her eyes catching the last light of dusk. "Henry? Yeah? I want to write about this someday. Love isn't a grand gesture, but a quiet one." He nodded. "Then write it. And what would you call it?" He smiled, eyes on the stars now peeking through the trees. "The quiet that lasts." Dear reader, if this story has walked with you through heartbreak, healing, or even the soft reminder that love doesn't always arrive the way we imagine, thank you. Thank you for letting Layla and Henry find their way through your imagination. Their journey is complete, but yours might just be beginning. And if you've ever found yourself in the quiet, wondering whether it's an ending or a beginning, like them, you'll learn it can be both. If this story moved you even a little, leave us a comment. Tell us what stayed with you. Share your thoughts, favorite part, or a word that lingered. Like and follow our channel to be part of more heartfelt journeys like this one, because sometimes the softest stories are the ones we need most.